Hello, everyone. Mr. Salinas here. I'm going to go ahead and take some time and kind of talk about the HIPP analysis in a different way. I feel that the first time we went around this and watching Mr. Bonner's video and some of the information I gave you just wasn't as applicable, or at least down to earth, if you will, with some of these ideas. So let's get started here. So when you look at HIPP, just know that this is a great tool to use when you're analyzing, or what many people call sourcing, a document. And another thing to keep in mind is that when you're looking at these particular tools, you only need to utilize one of them. So, for example, if you were given a prompt, a DBQ prompt that dealt with slavery, and you're looking at a document and you did a historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and a point of view, and you felt that the purpose was the strongest one that you came up with based on your knowledge of history, you may use the purpose to answer that question and to analyze that particular document. So you don't need to use all of them, but it is a good idea just to mentally or even write some things down for each of these categories. For some of these documents, historical situation might be your strong suit, intended audience might be. It kind of depends on your knowledge of history, but it also depends on the type of document. All right, so those are some tips in working with the sourcing material. So let's get started here. The historical situation, also the context. So what are you answering here? You're answering what's going on when this document was written. That's what you're answering. Some things to keep in mind is, how does the document connect to a specific historical event, to specific circumstances of time and place, and so on. So I'll show you a modern example here in just a moment, but you really want to, again, put this in its context. You want to explain what's going on in a broader sense, and oftentimes this is at the national level or even global level. Okay. Intended audience. Intended audience, you want to identify a person or a group the author expects to inform or influence. So let's take King Philip, the Metacom source that I had you look at. When you look at the intended audience, King Metacom, or better yet, King Philip, is trying to persuade, or at least trying to target this to other natives. A lot of you said the Wampanoag tribe, and while that is somewhat true, the real intended audience was the other tribes, and that bleeds into the purpose. But that's one of the things I was wanting you guys to identify. So when you look at intended audience, you want to see what the authors aim, what they write to a particular group of people. Intended audience involves identifying a person or a group that the author expects to inform or influence. And that's really the key here. You want to look at inform and influence. Those are going to be very important when you determine intended audience. All right, so let me go ahead and get rid of this here. All right, our next one is purpose. So the purpose is simply answering, why did the author create the source? Please know, everything has a purpose. Everything we do as human beings have a purpose. And so you really need to consider that. So for example, we will be looking at a source called The Bloody Massacre, and it's Paul Revere's essentially account of what happened when the British military men, redcoats, or better yet, regulars, as they were referred to, shot colonists in Boston. When he drew this picture, he made the British regulars, their military personnel, look aggressive. They had these mean faces on them. And his purpose wasn't so much to tell the truth, it was really to influence patriotism among colonists. So that's just a very specific example, and a very one with right off the bat, a real purpose to. Some documents will be difficult to identify the purpose, but most of the time you can kind of tell by the tone of the author. Okay? And then point of view, probably one of the toughest. So what you do here is, you want to know who the author and how did the author's background impact their perspective. So this might include gender, it might include race, it might include their experience, a status of some sort. This is all going to be important to know. So for example, let's take a look at gender. If a woman is writing or a woman, an account where a woman is the author, and it's prior to 1800, that gender is going to matter. It may be that a woman is writing about voting, so that is that the woman who can't vote is writing about voting. That's impactful, and you need to identify that. Sometimes it's race. Again, sometimes it's the experience. Okay, so again, we're going to go over this HIP analysis to a modern example. So let's get started on that. So here we have Colin Kaepernick, and for those that don't know who he is, he was a NFL quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. You'll notice the San Francisco 49er helmet in the background, and basically Kaepernick had a really successful year, and after that 1 year, he began to, lose. I guess you could say he got figured out in terms of other his opponents. And this is something that happens quite often, but that's not the point. The point here is that Kaepernick did have status, and he was somebody who decided to kneel during the national anthem at the beginning of the football games, and this became very controversial. Some people saw this as disrespectful. He viewed it as, he was standing for social justice. More specifically, he was trying to, make aware that police brutality was something that minorities faced, and so it became very controversial. So I'm going to show you this this clip here, and he's being interviewed, and he is essentially being asked why he did what he did. Okay, so again, I kind of went into the context right now. And remember, context is going to really depend on the student and their knowledge of history or just their knowledge of current events in this case. All right. I happen to be an NFL fan. I like to watch the NFL, so I happen to know this. Some of you may know it just because it became, very popular or very controversial. So again, it's all just going to depend. Nonetheless, here we go. Let's watch this clip real quick and pay attention to what he says and who he is saying it to.
I mean, ultimately, it's to bring awareness and make people.
I just realized that the speakers aren't very good, so bear with me here 1 second. Alright, sorry about that, guys.
I mean, ultimately, it's to bring awareness and make people, realize what's really going on in this country. There are a lot of things that are going on that are unjust. People aren't being held accountable for, and that's something that needs to change. That's something that, this country stands for: freedom, liberty, justice for all, and it's not happening for all right now. I'll continue to sit. I'm going to continue to stand with the people that are being oppressed. To me, this is something that has to change. And when there's significant change, and I feel like that flag represents what it's supposed to represent, and this country is representing people the way that it's supposed to, I'll stand. There's people being murdered unjustly and not being held accountable. Cops are getting paid leave for killing people. That's not right. That's not right by anyone's standards.
NBC.
Alright, so watching that and watching what he said, let's go ahead and do the HIP analysis on this, okay? So we have a source. In this case, it's a primary source because he did the interview during that time. So what's the historical situation? Well, the historical situation is simply that America has a national conversation on race. Specifically, more recently, professional athletes or people that are influential are voicing their opinion on police brutality. And we see this going on right now, Black Lives Matter movement, and all those kind of current events, if you will. So, in terms of the historical situation, that's the context. My question to you then is, who's the intended audience here? Okay, so in your mind, think about it. Who do you think he is trying to send this message? Who's the person or people or group of people that he's trying to get the attention of? So I'll pause here for a couple seconds. Some of you might be saying the press, the people that had the microphone right next to him, right? Maybe some of you are thinking the police or Americans in general, right? The general American population. Okay, all of these would be accurate. I think in terms of all of those ones listed, the general American public would be probably the most important one. And I say American public because obviously this is an American issue. It's an American sport and it's dealing with the American national anthem. So his intended audience clearly is to the American people. Now, let's look at the purpose. The purpose of what he's saying, what he is doing, is to make aware, right? It's to make these general American population aware of what is happening. Now, again, this is not about whether we agree or disagree. We are just simply making observations. We're gathering information and we're trying to do an analysis on his speech. We're historians here. And that's exactly what I'm asking you to do. So, given the context, given the audience, the purpose behind this is to influence, or at least to bring awareness to the realities, according to Kaepernick, about police brutality. Now, the point of view. Remember, the point of view is asking you to figure out who is this person, given his situation, why does that matter? So when we did this in class, we identified some of the things that are factual, right? 1, he is a male. 2, he's a professional football player. 3, that means he might be wealthy. 4, he's biracial, so he's probably classified as an African American. Okay, so those are all things that we listed. Now, when we listed those, all of those are accurate, but which one is the most important one to probably point out, right, for the point of view? Which one matters of all of those? And if you're thinking African American, you would be correct, because giving the context, giving the subject matter, him being an African American himself, or at least partly, clearly this is affecting his perspective. Okay, so there you go. That is a HIPP on a modern example. Okay, so that is hopefully something you can take away that will make a lot more sense. Now, let's take TikTok. All right, so here I have a statement from a TikTok spokesman on August 8th, 2020. Let's take a look at what it says. These are the facts. 100 million Americans came to TikTok for entertainment and connection, especially during the pandemic. We've hired nearly 1,000 people to our U.S. team this year alone, and we are proud to be hiring another 10,000 employees into great paying jobs across the U.S. Our $1 billion Creator Fund supports U.S. creators who are building livelihoods from our platform. TikTok U.S. user data is stored in the U.S. with strict controls on employee access. TikTok's biggest investors come from the U.S. We are committed to protecting our users' privacy and safety as we continue working to bring joy to families and meaningful careers to those who create on our platform. Again, let's do a HIPP. What's this historical situation? Well, the historical situation is simply that we are in the era of social media. And with the pandemic, we're on our phones more. We're doing a lot more electronically based viewing or interacting or engaging. Also, the current administration, the Trump administration, has more recently advocated to ban TikTok, primarily because of a security issue. If you don't know this, TikTok is a Chinese company, right? So, being that it's a communist country, there's this thought that the Chinese government can essentially, acquire information from this company. So, like, if military personnel is on TikTok and they're using GPS location, TikTok obviously has where the base is, and that might be a security issue. Okay, these are just some of the objective observations that revolve the historical situation. So to understand why we're even talking about this, we have to understand that President Trump wants to ban it, and that's been controversial. Who's the intended audience? So who do you think this spokesman is intending to persuade or to influence? Okay. Now, if you're thinking, well, it would be the American people, you would be correct. More specifically, probably TikTok users. probably TikTok users in the US. I would even go as far as to say that the intended audience really is the federal government, the Trump administration, because they're the ones trying to ban them. So that makes sense. What's the purpose? Okay, again, intended audience and the purpose goes back and forth. All right, or at least they bleed into each other. The purpose here is to really ease the minds of the federal government or the Trump administration and its users that TikTok is not housing any information from of their users in China. That it's all U.S. based, and this makes them distinct. So they're trying to reassure their users and the federal government that they are okay, that they should not be banned. So that's the purpose. The point of view, what you should identify, a couple things. Is your gender in here? No, we don't know if this is a male or female. Does it matter? No, in this case it does not. Okay, what about in terms of who this person is? Well, it just says spokesman, right? But the thing that you should probably be pointing out right now is that this individual works for TikTok. So that may affect its reliability or the credibility of it. In other words, because they represent TikTok, they probably have the best interest in TikTok. Therefore, what they're saying is only going to benefit their company. So there may be some credibility issues with that. Okay, and that's important to note. So again, this is the point of the analysis. So if we break it down this way, we can then kind of put this statement in its time and place, and as historians, we can use this to show validity, to show connection, to understand our time and place. And this is what historians do, and this is what you need to acquire as a skill. Okay? All right. Lastly, here is a primary source account, and this is from a DBQ. And the prompt for the DBQ says, explain the causes of the development of the institution of slavery in the period from 1607 to 1750. And here's the source. It says, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owner made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism, should by virtue of their baptism be made free. It is enacted and declared by the Grand Assembly that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of a person as to his bondage or freedom. That masters, freed from his doubt, may be more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, though slaves, to be admitted to the sacrament. Source, Virginia General Assembly, 1667. All right, so this timeline obviously is within the time range we were given. So let's do the historical context. So we're talking about 1660s, we're talking about Virginia, and we're talking about General Assembly. So a voting body, a legislative body. Okay, so it's Virginia. We know that Virginia is a colony for Great Britain. We know that its number one source, or at least cash crop, is tobacco. We also know that Bacon's Rebellion has shifted its labor force from indentured servitude to African slaves. So the context we're talking about is a growing or a demand for African slavery during colonial America. Now we look at the intended audience. Well, who is this made out to? So to understand that, you got to understand what we're actually reading. What we're reading here is basically a law. And the law is really situating or being explicit that African Americans, and when they have children and they are baptized, they still remain slaves. That just by being baptized, or the sacrament of baptism, which if you don't know is usually one of the many or one of the sacraments or rites before you become Christian, or to be Christian you must be baptized. So there's this concern that if you baptize an African American child, that they might have a new status, a Christian brotherhood, if you will. And what does that do for, legally speaking, for the slave owner? So when you look at the intended audience, you should be guessing that this is addressed to slave owners. That's the intended audience, because it's not meant for African American slaves because they can't read English, or at least they're not promoted to read English. And it's not for poor white people because the poor white people do not own slaves. It's really meant for the land elite that owns these plantations. That's who the intended audience. The purpose is to reassure them. Okay, so if we look at how this breaks down, again, we have the historical situation. The intended audience is the citizens of Virginia, but specifically slaveholding class. The purpose, again, is to inform slaveholders that if they wish to introduce religion to their slaves, they may, and this is a typo, they may do so without any fear, that they may be liberating them as Christian souls. So again, it's to really ease the mind of slave owners and to maybe, push Christianity on their slaves without consequences of the slaves, asking for freedom or being seen equal. Okay, so there's a shift in how laws are being made here to adhere to the slave culture that's being born in the South. The point of view here, just a rule of thumb, the point of view is a very weak point when you're looking at a proclamation or a law. So since this is an excerpt, it does not particularly have a point of view. It is what it is, in other words, it is pro-slavery in content and intent. So when you ever read a primary source that's a proclamation or a law, just note that the point of view is really going to be a non-issue. You want to focus on purpose, intended audience, and historical situation. So taking this first prompt then, and explain the causes of the development of the institution of slavery in the period 1607 to 1750. You can then go to this and pick one of these three out: historical situation, intended audience, or purpose, in order to answer or connect to this prompt. So you may talk about that the development of slavery, of the institution of slavery, really became a reality because we saw that people that were landowners and that owned slaves were being tailored to. They were being, they were adhering to them, so they can continue this economic venture that was making the state of or the colony of Virginia a lot of money. Okay, again, coming back to the whole idea of economics. Okay. All right, so that is your HIPP, and those are three examples that I'm hoping that you find useful and that you can apply this to when you do a DBQ, which will be in the near future. Okay, thank you guys for listening, and please email me if you have any questions.